The founder of First NBC Bank, Ashton Ryan, facing more federal felony charges over the $1 billion collapse of the local bank. Ryan was charged with 44 of 46 counts of conspiracy, bank fraud, and false statements in July of 2020, accused of lending money to people who couldn't pay it back and lying to board members about the loans to justify higher salaries. Two other former bank officers and one of their borrowers were also charged. Today's superseding indictment adds 3 new counts of bank fraud and false statements and names another former bank officer, Fred Beebe of Donaldsonville. Ryan and the others charged last summer have pleaded not guilty.